Hi everybody, we're going to do chapter 26 in two parts. So here is the beginning of part one. All right, so the business cycle is where we're going to begin, and you're going to see a graph on the next, a diagram on the next slide, but there are four phases of the business cycle. And what's important to understand is when you look at these different phases, you see how things work out. So what is important here? Well, what we have is basically a situation like this, where we go up and down and up and down, and the business cycle is sort of constantly doing that. Well, when we're at the top of a cycle, we call that the peak. When we're at the bottom, we call it a trough. And then in the middle, the book calls it recession. I prefer to call it contraction. And the reason for that is recession, as we've mentioned before, requires a period of shrinking GDP. Well, your GDP can be growing less, but still growing, and it feels a little bit like a recession. It's not a recession, so I prefer the term contraction. And then I also prefer, in this period, I prefer recovery, because it is hard to say that expansion is the right word when you're only getting back to kind of where you were, to a previous peak. Once you get used to being up here and then you go down to here, it's hard to imagine, at least until you get back to where you were, as an expansion, right? If you lose 20 pounds and then you gain back 20 pounds, it's hard to say that you are heavier than you were, right? You're just getting back to where you had been. I'd like to call this idea expansion, right? And then in terms of what a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of GDP shrinking, of GDP actually going down. So those are the 4 areas, but what we are probably most concerned with is this trend line, right? And as long as over time the line is trending upward, then we're probably in decent shape. Because most people have a relatively long view on the economy, right? When you get a job, you have to have that job for 40 years. So if the economy has peaks and valleys along the way, you sort of understand that. The question, of course, is do people prefer growth and contraction like this, or do they want things like this? And by and large, people want, the more it can be like this, the happier people are going to be. There's only a very small number of people who want heavy volatility, and those are people who, are in the financial world in a way that they make money whether things go up or down. They just want lots of movement. But the average person who's just showing up to work wants to stay as close as possible to this growth trend. But at the end of the day, if you start here and you end here, it doesn't matter very much whether you get to it from this or from that. You wind up in the same place 20 years later. So you can pause and take a look here at some information about U.S. recessions that have happened this century. Now, what causes these fluctuations? And believe it or not, economists do not completely agree. But most people will say that shocks are definitely part of it, that prices being sticky are definitely part of it, and that output and employment are definitely both affected. But remember, the classical economists would say that if prices were not sticky, if they could move, then we would have much smaller fluctuations. But the fact that the prices are sticky means that our lows go much lower because it takes so long for the prices to sort of evolve and regulate so that we can then recover. Okay? So let's look at some shocks. Well, we know that that innovation is irregular. There's no doubt about that. The internet happened pretty quickly. Nobody was really sure that it was going to happen. You can look back over time, and these, especially the positive economic situations, happen in a very unpredictable way. Productivity changes, obviously the internet's another good example of that. The activities of the Federal Reserve, so the Federal Reserve has a lot of pretty vocal critics, and those folks would say that the choices made by the Fed about monetary policy will also contribute. We all understand that political events like wars or what's happening in the financial systems in other parts of the world have a big impact, and I think that's pretty true. And then just general financial instability. So, for example, when banks make bad decisions, make bad bets, and then things that happen on Wall Street wind up bleeding back to Main Street. Now, the recession of 2007 is instructive in a lot of ways. So in that situation, there were just a confluence of overconfidence and bad decisions, which led to a number of things all happening at once in a very bad way. But I think the main ideas are there was too much money in the money supply. People were basically using their homes like ATMs, so the real estate prices just became totally crazy and unsustainable. And then there were some geopolitical factors across the world as well that made that, in hindsight, pretty obvious that it was going to happen. Now, when things start to get bad, the reason is typically, because people stop buying stuff, right? And durable goods are the things that are typically affected most because these are big purchases. There are things that are going to last 3 or more years, and typically they are things that you can afford to not purchase for one reason or another. You can fix your old one rather than, these aren't things that wear out. These aren't things that get totally consumed. They are things that become less valuable over time. But, if your refrigerator breaks and you are concerned about the future of your job, it's pretty easy to bring the serviceman in and have your refrigerator fixed. But if times were good, you might just put that one on the curb and go out and buy a new one, right? Whereas if you have no food in the house and you're not real sure about your job, you're still going to go out and buy food. So those sort of non-durable consumer goods, they're going to be less affected. So it's the durable goods in C, right? So we talked about IG and how gross investment is one of those things that is very volatile. Within C, we said C was not very volatile. Durable goods are a portion of C, and durable goods are the volatile part of C, though you can imagine cars and refrigerators and washing machines and things like that are a small portion of the total amount of money that families spend in a given year, typically. All right, we're going to talk about unemployment now, and this is a really important graph. Pay a lot of attention to it. So when we talk about unemployment, what we have to understand is this tiny little section down here, this is unemployment. This huge section up here, these are all the people who are not working, but they're not unemployed. They don't want to work, either because they are children, they're in prison or some sort of mental institution, or they're not in the labor force. This would be primarily retirees, but also, stay-at-home parents and things like that. So the labor force, right? The labor force is made up of people who are employed and people who are unemployed, okay? But half or so of the nation, about half of the country, is not even in the labor force. They aren't even interested in having a job for one reason or another, okay? So we have to pay attention to that. That's partially what we're going to be really paying close attention to. So what we will have is a quick discussion about what the problems with unemployment are. And what we have are a bunch of people who work part-time who are wishing that they were working full-time, but they're not. So they have a job, which means they're employed, but their job is not what they want. Okay, so that's a big problem. Part-time workers and full-time workers are both considered employed. Discouraged workers, so these are people who would like to be employed, but remember, an aspect of being unemployed is that you are actively seeking a job. Well, if you have become convinced that there's nothing you can do that's going to get you hired, so you stop looking, well, you do want a job, you just aren't looking, so that makes you not unemployed. But this group of people is very hard to tease out. Now, there are 3 types of unemployment: frictional unemployment, structural, and cyclical. So frictional unemployment, these are people who basically voluntarily leave their position in order to go do something else. There's very little that can be done about this, so it doesn't really play into the conversation. Then there's structural unemployment. These are people who, for whatever reason, do not have the skills that are demanded in the labor pool. So there just isn't much that can be done here other than retraining these people. And then there's cyclical unemployment. These are people whose skills are useful, but because the economy is not in a good position, those people do not have jobs. This is the group that policymakers are typically targeting. A little bit of targeting this group with educational programs, retraining programs. But for the most part, if we can make the economy better, all these people who are cyclically unemployed will become employed again, and then our unemployment rate will go down. So that brings us to the natural rate of unemployment. We do not strive to have an unemployment rate of 0. Basically, if we go back, you remember frictional unemployment. An unemployment rate of 0 would mean that these people weren't allowed to be not working, which obviously would be problematic. Okay? And obviously then these structurally unemployed people, people who don't have skills, would also be employed. That would be problematic as well. So the natural rate of unemployment means that cyclical equals 0, but whatever level of structure and whatever level of frictional still goes on. Now what the NRU is changes based on demographics, it changes on job search methods and public policy and things like that. So we can have unemployment that is different from the NRU, the natural rate of unemployment. And we typically do. In fact, not all economists even agree on what the natural rate of unemployment ought to be, but most say it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4%. So when we have unemployment, that creates a GDP gap because the potential GDP, what we could make if everybody who wanted to work were working, is bigger than what we're actually doing. So it gives us a GDP gap that's bad. It gives us a negative GDP gap. And an economist named Akun came up with this little law that says for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, meaning for every percentage above the NRU that our unemployment is, that creates a 2% GDP gap. So let's say that the NRU equals 4 and the unemployment rate is 5. That means we have 1% cyclical, which means we have a 2% GDP gap, which obviously is problematic. All right, so you can see during the late 90s when everything was really humming along, that was prior to the small recession that we had here, before the big recession that we had here, we get this positive GDP gap. Okay, so this is kind of why everybody talks about the 90s as such a great time. But here's our unemployment rate sort of since, basically about your lifetime plus a decade. You can see in 2009 it went high, but now we're in the mid-4s. So we're basically about back to the lowest that we've been, in my working lifetime or my aware lifetime. Obviously, I was in high school back then. Now, unemployment is unequally distributed. So, teenagers, minorities, women typically have problems within this. There are also certain occupations that have extremely low unemployment and other occupations that have very high unemployment. Education is the main driver. And then obviously unemployment that lasts for a short period of time is very different from unemployment that lasts for a long period of time. You can pause and take a look at this. These are demographic groups and unemployment rates broken up over time. It's kind of interesting. And then we're going to talk about this during class, but these are the non-economic costs of unemployment. And we've hinted at this already in class, so pause and take a look. And then we're going to pick up with inflation in the next video. Thanks, gentlemen.